Hello everybody, we're going to hit you up with another presidential election. This one, the election of 1948, three-way race. You guys, let's see who comes out on top right now. Now we're going to start off with the incumbent party, and that is the Democrats. Harry S. Truman of Missouri, the incumbent president. He ascends to the presidency after the death of FDR on April 12, 1945. He sees through the end of World War II. May 8, 1945, the Nazis surrender, ending the war in Europe. While in August of 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrenders and ends the war in the Pacific and ends World War II as a whole. Japan would end up being occupied by the Allies until, I believe, the early 1950s. While Germany would be occupied by the Allies and then eventually separated in the East and West and not reunited until 1990. But nonetheless, Harry S. Truman is the president, and by the time 1948 rolls around, he's unpopular. And he is facing some opposition to his nomination. That opposition coming from Senator Richard Russell Jr. of Georgia, Senator Claude Pepper of Florida, General Dwight Eisenhower of New York, and Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. Now, Eisenhower is going to decline the Democratic nomination, and at the Democratic National Convention, Truman is going to be nominated for a full term as president. He's going to bring along for the ride Alben W. Barkley, a senator from Kentucky who gave the keynote address at the DNC for vice president. Now, a civil rights platform was passed at the Democratic National Convention, which led Southern delegates, which led about some 36 Southern delegates, led by the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, to walk out of the Democratic National Convention and form their own party, which is the States' Rights Democratic Party, or Dixiecrats. Now, also, Democrats suffered another split because some liberals, walked out of the Democratic National Convention, and they formed a new progressive party, and they nominated Henry A. Wallace as their presidential candidate. Wallace was FDR's vice president. He was FDR's Secretary of Agriculture, and he would eventually become also the Secretary of Commerce. Now that we have our Democratic ticket of Truman and Barkley, let's go to the Dixiecrats. Now, the Dixiecrats were formed by the delegates that walked out of the Democratic National Convention, and they formed their party for basically one purpose: to maintain racial segregation in the South and maintain the Jim Crow laws that were allowing segregation to take place in the South. And they put their candidates up for nomination: the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond, who led the walkout, and the governor of Arkansas, Benjamin T. Laney. Laney declines to be nominated, so Thurmond gets the nomination, and he's going to bring along for the ride the governor of Mississippi, Fielding L. Wright, as his running mate. Now that we have the Dixiecrat ticket of Thurmond and Wright, let's go to the Republicans. Now, the Republicans coming up big in 1946, taking control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the 1920s, and they're putting their own slate of candidates up for nomination. That is the governor of New York, Thomas E. Dewey, Ohio Senator Robert A. Taft, Minnesota's Harold Stassen, Arthur H. Vandenberg, Senator of Michigan, the governor of California, Earl Warren, Douglas MacArthur of New York, who commanded the Allies in the Pacific, the Speaker of the House, Joseph W. Martin Jr. of Massachusetts, General Eisenhower, and Senator John W. Bricker of Ohio. Now, Eisenhower is also going to decline the Republican nomination, and he declines because he believed that soldiers should keep out of politics. And at the end of the day, it is going to be Dewey who receives the Republican nomination for president. Remember, he was nominated in 1944 by the Republicans, so this is his second time in a row receiving the Republican nomination. He's going to bring along for the ride Governor Warren as his running mates. Now that we have our three tickets, Democrats Truman Barkley, Dixiecrats Thurman and Wright, and Republicans Dewey and Warren, Dixiecrat and Republicans full of governors. Let's get to the campaign and let's see who's going to win this thing. Now, given Truman's sinking popularity and the seemingly fatal three-way split in the Democratic Party, Dewey appeared unbeatable. Top Republicans believed that all Dewey had to do to win was to avoid major mistakes. So in keeping with this advice, Dewey carefully avoided risks. He spoke in platitudes, he avoided controversial issues, and he was vague on what he planned to do as president. Speech after speech was filled with non-political, optimistic assertions of the obvious, including the now infamous quote, "You know that your future is still ahead of you." An editorial in the Louisville Courier-Journal summed it up as such: "No presidential candidate in the future will be so inept that 4 of his major speeches can be boiled down to these historic 4 sentences. Agriculture is important. Our rivers are full of fish. You cannot have freedom without liberty. Our future lies ahead." Now, Truman, trailing in the polls, decided to adopt a slashing, no-holds-barred campaign. He ridiculed Dewey by name, criticized Dewey's refusal to address specific issues, and scornfully targeted the Republican-controlled 80th Congress with a wave of relentless and blistering partisan assaults. He nicknamed the Republican-controlled Congress as the Do-Nothing Congress, a remark which brought strong criticism from Republican congressional leaders, but no comment from Dewey. In fact, Dewey rarely mentioned Truman's name during the campaign, which fit into his strategy of appearing to be above petty partisan politics. So basically, 2 polar opposite campaigns here. Dewey running a campaign where he's not going to say what he'll do if he was elected president. He's going to avoid divisive issues. Basically not trying to make a mistake. And Truman is running a blistering campaign. He's running a vigorous campaign against Dewey, despite the fact that he is unpopular and he is trailing in the polls. Now, under Dewey's leadership, the Republicans had enacted a platform at their 1948 convention that called for expanding Social Security, more funding for public housing, civil rights legislation, and promotion of health and education by the federal government. These positions were, however, unacceptable to the conservative congressional Republican leadership. Truman exploited this rift in the opposing party by calling a special session of Congress on Turnip Day, quote unquote, and daring the Republican congressional leadership to pass its own platform. The 80th Congress played into Truman's hands, delivering very little in the way of substantive legislation during this time. Truman simply ignored the fact that Dewey's policies were considerably more liberal than most of his fellow Republicans, and instead he concentrated his fire against what he characterized as the conservative obstructionist tendencies of the unpopular 80th Congress. Now, Truman, he toured much of the nation with his fiery rhetoric, playing to large enthusiastic crowds. Can't talk today. The slogan, "Give 'em hell, Harry," was popular, and this was shouted out at stop after stop along the tour. Now, the polls and the pundits, they all held that Dewey's lead was insurmountable and that Truman's efforts were for naught. Indeed, Truman's own staff considered the campaign a last hurrah, and even Truman's own wife, Bess, had private doubts that her husband could win. The only person who appears to have considered Truman's campaign to be winnable was Truman himself. who confidently predicted victory to anyone and everyone who would listen to him. Now, in the final weeks of the campaign, American movie theaters agreed to play 2 short newsreel-like campaign films in support of the 2 major party candidates, each film having been created by its respective campaign organization. The Dewey film, shot professionally on an impressive budget, featured very high production values, which somehow reinforced an image of the New York governor as cautious and distant. The Truman film, meanwhile, was hastily assembled on virtually no budget by the perpetually cash-short Truman campaign, relied heavily on public domain and newsreel footage of the president taking part in major world events and signing important legislation. Excuse me. Perhaps unintentionally, the Truman film visually reinforced an image of him as engaged and decisive. Now, years later, historian David McCullough cited the expensive but lackluster Dewey film and the far cheaper but more effective Truman film as important factors in determining the preferences of undecided voters. Now, as the campaign was drawing to a close, the polls showed that Truman was gaining, though Truman lost all 9 of the Gallup poll's post-convention surveys. Dewey's Gallup lead dropped from 17 points in late September to 9 points in mid-October to just 5 by the end of the month. Now, although Truman was gaining momentum, most political analysts were reluctant to break with the conventional wisdom and say that a Truman victory was a serious possibility. And in the campaign's final days, many newspapers, magazines, and political pundits were so confident of Dewey's impending victory, they wrote articles to be printed the morning after the election speculating about the new Dewey presidency. And when Truman made his way to his hometown of Independence, Missouri to watch the election returns, some among his inner circle had already accepted other jobs, and not a single reporter traveling on his campaign train, thought that he would win. But Truman is going to prove the pundits and all other people that believed that he had no chance of winning a full term wrong. And we're going to take a look at the results right now. The Democrats survive the 3-way split within the party. Truman is going to be elected to a full term. He's going to win 303 electoral votes. Dewey and the Republicans are going to pick up 189. And Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats are going to pick up 39 electoral votes. 28 states end up voting for Truman and the Democrats. 16 states end up voting for Dewey and the Republicans. And the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina are going to end up voting for Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats. So the Dixiecrats breaking into that solid South. And that solid South will start to come apart in the preceding elections. In terms of the popular vote, Truman's going to finish first, not with the majority of the popular vote, but with a plurality of the popular vote. But remember, popular vote doesn't matter in U.S. presidential elections. Truman's going to win 49.6% of the popular votes. Dewey and the Republicans are going to gain 45.1%. While Thurmond and the Dixiecrats are going to gain 2.4% of the popular vote. So Truman survives. Truman survives the split within his own party, and he and the Democrats pull off an upset win. Now, will he run for a second full term in 1952? We'll talk about that election next time. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got a lot out of it. Truman really pulling one out of the hat. You guys, comes to show that a split in a political party doesn't necessarily mean that party's going to lose. that election, that upcoming election. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos, go ahead and watch those if you want. And with that, we will see you next time.